In this section, we will discuss about the educational movement and reforms. Through the educational movement and reform, we will be discuss sort of the explanation of the first, the nature of educational movement, second, the early educational movements, the third, the alternative education and related movements, fourth, the structural and curricular changes in the schools, and the last, we will summary it. So, let's do. The nature of educational movements. As we know, the system changed because of constant internal and external pressures from many sources. In the figure 13.3, we note some sources of change in educational system that we can undoubtedly think of more. The change is brought about in one system or subsystem of society, such as education or politics. It will affect the other systems. Social movements are one major indication of the direction in which a society is moving and of the constant pressure for change on part of the system. The term of social movement has been used to refer to numerous collective efforts for change or resistance to change that include the women's rights movement, civil rights movement, prohibition movement, anti-war movement, right to life movement, and more recently, the Tea Party movement and Black Lives Matter. Movement arise because large groups of people are dissatisfied with existing conditions. Adherent focus on a general guiding ideology or philosophy, a strong idealism and dedication to this ideology, and some form of action. Movement often generate counter-movement which seek to prevent reformers from achieving the change they seek, like the marriage equality movement versus the group seeking to restrict marriage to a man and woman. There has never been a time when all members of a society were content with the society or its educational system. The supporters of a movement are generally attempting to bring about or resist some change in society. Their motives for involvement in a movement vary, from idealism to the personal satisfaction of belonging to a group of believers and having cause. Problems in society may first come to light because of a growing social movement. If a movement catches on and attracts a large number of adherents, it is likely to have a direct impact on the existing system. It often starts out as a small fringe group, backing the general trends with the development of leadership and communication network such as a newsletter, website, or social media presence, Twitter for example. And with the attention of the media, more people are attracted to the movement. Eventually, ideas from the movement may be adopted by schools or other institutions and become institutionalized, that is accepted as an integral part of society. Some social movements attract few followers and eventually die. These are often groups pushing for ideas that are not easily integrated into the existing system. And the large social movement is likely to include splinter groups or small groups of reformers or radicals supporting specific, related ideologies and causing internal dissent as movement supporters quarrel over means and ends. The movement may be organized or they may be unstructured and without clear leadership, as in the case of counterculture movement from which free schools were spawned in the late 1960s and early 1970s. However, individuals or books presenting common threads or ideologies such as this desire for individuality and freedom hold movement together by formalizing their philosophy and goals. Several typologies of movements have been constructed. The following is a summary of types of social movement most relevant to our discussion. First, the reform movements. Second, the regressive movement. Third, the revolutionary movement. Fourth, the utopian movement. We will discuss the first, that the reform movements believe that certain reforms are necessary, usually in specific areas of society such as education. Then the second is the regressive movement is aimed to put the clock back, reverse current trend, and return a former state of affairs. which the revolutionary movement are deeply dissatisfied with the existing order and seek to reorganize society, including education. And then the fourth is the utopian movement that include loosely constructed collectivities arguing for radical change, such as the 1960s countercultural movement. From the countercultural movement of the 1960s emerged the free school movement, and then this movement developed as a reaction to the structured authoritarian schools and led to development of schools with freedom of choice and little structure. Initially, this was a fairly isolated by the utopian movement. As more people learned about its philosophy of education, several things happened. First, some were attracted and joined, and then the others were intrigued out, but rather than join the movement and give up their position in the society or the educational system, they adopt a middle ground or compromise position. Like they accepted some ideas that could be adapted to fit within the existing system without major structural change, and these people acted as change agents in what now took on reform movement. Third is the educational system faced external pressure from the educational movements and from persons within who wished to adopt the movement's ideas. Next, we will discuss about the early educational movement. Like, education has always been a part of society's way of acculturating its young, of teaching a child to become a member of society. Then, education is found in several forms: non-formal, informal, and formal. It's non-formal when a child learns the ways of his or her culture by being a member immersed and participating in that society, such as modeling parental behavior. Is informal in that a child may be taught through out of school activities such as the Girl Scout or youth soccer teams, and it's formal when a teacher provides instruction about certain aspect of his or her culture in a specific place, such as a school. First of all, in this early educational movement, we will discuss about the purpose and function for society. The education movement in the United States. Like the public school movement, the essential, the progressive education movement, humanistic education, and so forth. First, we will discuss about the purpose and function for society. In ancient Greece and Rome, privileged boys, seldom girls, were educated by wandering teachers called sophists, who taught youngsters the skills needed to develop their reasoning power and rhetoric, that is, the art of persuasion. This formal education met the needs of the society and was seen as a public good. Philosophers and Greek teachers such as Socrates, his student Plato, and Aristotle are still studied for their concept of the educated person, freedom of thought, and rational inquiry. Most children within such ancient societies learn the attributes needed as adults from non-formal educational forms instead. And then, during the Renaissance in Europe, the concept of the well-rounded and liberally educated person was developed. There was great interest in the humanistic aspect of Greek and Latin classics, in contrast to the sectarian education of the Reformation with its God-centered worldview. The secular education of the Renaissance focused on the earthly experience of human beings. Secular education only emerged in this country when public education expanded after the Civil War under the Morrill Act of 1863, and so social efficiency goals from which individuals could also benefit. Other the period of European history that had an effect on American education was the Enlightenment of the 18th century. It was believed that people could improve their life by reason, by using their minds to solve problems. Education would enable society to progress toward a new and better world, and schools were believed to be instruments for cultivating the reasoning power of youth. Then, we'll discuss about the educational movement in the United States, like the public school movement. In this movement, Until the early 19th century, many children in the United States attended only primary school. If they attended schools at all, schools at the secondary level were for the elite children who were sent up to prepare for the university, which would lead to occupation in the courts or in commerce. This pattern perpetuated an ended commercial class, however. The Civil War, urbanization, and industrialization led to demands for more access to education and a greater emphasis on private benefit. First, with the industrialization and urbanization of the northern United States, many people were concerned about the well-being of children. School provided one alternative to working long hours in factories. Second, industrialists sought ways to educate and urbanize those coming to towns from rural areas to make them reliable and compliant workers. Third, many wanted to Americanize and assimilate immigrants. Then the school appeared to be an institution that could solve these problems. Horace Mann, a member of the Massachusetts legislature during the late 1820s and 1830s, was the most forceful advocate and leader of the public school movement. It was Mann who pushed for the establishment of schools for all children free of charge, without religious teaching and financed through public taxation. He said, "Let the home and the church teach faith and values, and the school teach facts." Another innovation of Horace Mann was to seek the professionalization of teachers, like teacher training college or normal school were established. And then came at a time when social needs favored the development of mass education, like more education for more people. And then Mann also was famous for his articulation of education as the balance wheel of society. By educating the children of workers and the middle class, education helped to prevent poverty. He said, "Education gives each man the independence of the means by which he can resist the selfishness of other men. It does better than disarm the poor of their hostility towards the rich. It prevents being poor." And then, the progressive education movement, like this movement for public education during the first half of the 19th century, paralleled the wider social trend to integrate newcomers into an increasingly urban and industrial society. And this movement, led by the philosopher John Dewey and several of his students and associates, usually women, including Elizabeth Irwin, Lucy Sprague Mitchell, Caroline Pratt, Helen Parkhurst, and others. The movement was exemplified by New York private schools such as the Little Red Schoolhouse, the City and Country School, and Dalton School. The famous schools influenced public and private educators across the country, like the title of Irwin's early book, "Catholic with Lewis Mark," fitting the school to the child. This point to the child-centered orientation progressivism brought the schooling a major contrast with the perspective described by Finkelstein in Teacher Narratives during the mid and late 19th century. And then these recent controversies have surfaced over an offshoot of progressive education philosophy, like life skills. Course in sex and drug education, marriage, parenting, death and dying, values, gratification, money management, consumer knowledge, private education, house buying, insurance, and other practical skills seen by some as essential skill for students to have before leaving high school. Others believe that schools should concentrate on academic skills and that life skills should be taught at home, an offshoot of debates over what should be included in the high school curriculum and who should decide this. The next movement is the essentials. In the essential, Theodore Brumelt, who has written extensively on the various movements in American education, used the term essentialist to describe those involved in a 1950s movement opposing progressive education. Opposing the progressive education that mentioned below. Essentialists were particularly vexed about an offshoot of progressive education called the life adjustment movement, which they believed reduced education to teaching survival skills such as home economics, driver education, and personal hygiene, ignoring the intellectual mission of schooling to teach disciplines. Wow. That was a very rude, opposing. Next, we will discuss about the humanistic education. This American education in the 20th century follows the pendulum swing theory from rigor to relevance and back again. And then, the progressivism was in many ways a reaction to crimping, stultifying schools of Victorian utilitarianism. Essentialism was a reaction against progressivism, and the humanistic education movement of the 1960s and 1970s were a reaction to the authoritarianism that had never been given up by schools. It was a rediscovery of the teachings of the child-centered progressive. Leaders of the humanistic movement said that schools should eliminate coercive rules and regulation. That means it's so complicated ways from humanistic education to reform it. The last part, we will talking about the alternative education and related movement. From the humanistic philosophical perspective came the origin of the alternative education movement, with its emphasis on the whole child. It is impossible to speak of one philosophy that all in this movement share, but terms used to describe the school loosely adhere to philosophical tenets including free, open, innovative, experimental, new, and radical. Free schools refer to schools that give people freedom and choice, reflect qualities of openness, informality, flexibility, parental and community involvement, and integration in contrast to segregation and stress, intellectual, social, and emotional development, encourage self-knowledge, independence, and interdependence, stimulate creativity in an environment of shared responsibility, and minimize failure, competitiveness, authoritarianism, top-down administration, and expensive facilities. Summerhill was a small residential school set a village in England. It advocated a totally free learning environment and unrestrained spontaneity. The late A.S. Neil, who founded Summerhill in 1921, believed that to become fulfilled adults, children must be allowed to have a free experience, unfettered by the rules. The few rules of the school were established by the whole community in a democratic way, although regular classes from primary through secondary levels were offered, attendance were voluntary. Some free schools in the United States were patterned specifically on the Summerhill model. Others adopted aspects of the model. So there are many free schools in the United States that adopted by that school, the Summerhill school. And then talking about the developing world alternative educational movement, that like why changing the economic power structure was also the goal of some third world educators in pedagogy of the oppressed. Brazilian educator Paulo Freire asserted that literacy among oppressed peasants could be increased by leading these people to an awareness of cultural reality and thus giving them the knowledge and its attendant power to fight back against the oppressor. Freire devised a new method of teaching reading that achieved inconsiderable success among the people of poverty-stricken northeastern Brazil. The result was an increased politicalization of the peasantry, which was perceived as a threat by the government. And then, the next alternative education movement we talk about the open classroom that have their roots in the progressive education movement, sometimes called open education. Open schools and open space, they began in the 1970s and are characterized by the following specific concern. The first, concern over quality of teacher. The second, emphasize on cooperation and on competition few behavioral problems. Third, freedom of movement and use of materials within certain boundaries, communication among children, and the last is other factors related to positive self-image and willingness to take the risk and persist. Next, we will talking about the other alternative movements like back to basics. What is back to basics? Like from the alternative education movement, the swing of the pendulum moved to the conservative side. Emerging in the early 1980s, the movement referred to as back to basics features good old-fashioned reading, writing, and arithmetic with a good dose of discipline thrown in none of the frills such as humanistic education of the arts. Supporters of basic skills education argued that schools should be guided by essentialist principles, including the following: First, the elementary school curriculum should aim to cultivate basic tool skills that contribute to literacy and mastery of arithmetical computation. Second, the secondary curriculum should cultivate competencies in history, mathematics, science, literature, English, and foreign languages. Third, schooling requires discipline and respect for legitimate authority. Fourth, learning requires hard work and disciplined attention. That's so good. We were talking about the back to basic. And then next is the private school. Like the private school business owes a great deal to back to basic proponents. This school. Private schools thrive on the discontent of frustrated parents who want a reprieve from the conflict over discretion, the perceived lack of discipline, and the apparent lowering of standard, like many others. The categories of private school include elite preparatory, often boarding schools such as Choate, Phillips, Andover, Groton, Lawrence Seville, that cater to the wealthy who plan to go to elite college like Cooksoon and Purcell. Specialist school for the disabled or gifted, military academies, and religious sectarian day schools sponsored by Catholic, Jewish, Baptist, Lutheran, Quaker, Fundamentalist Christian, and other religious groups. Today, the largest percentage of private school students attend Catholic-affiliated school, though that number went down from 45% to 39.6% of private schools between the fall of 1995 and the fall of 2011. These private schools meet the preference of many different people holding various beliefs about the role of education. And then, the last, we will talk about the accountability movement, like refers to mean specifying educational standard of competency and measuring student outcomes against school expenditures. The accountability movement arose in reaction to the humanistic emphasis in education. Of paramount concern was the attempt to account for taxpayer dollars spent and to hold someone responsible, usually teacher, for the output of schools and measured by student achievement. Some educational writers arguing for reforms in the school supported the idea of accountability. Many threads have come together to foster the growth and accountability movement, including both liberal and conservative voices. That was the accountability movement. The last, we will talk about the summary of this section, of this chapter. The summary. First, the social and educational movement reflect the diversity of opinion present in a society as well as the range of perceived options. System experience pressure to change from movement in society. Change may involve minor modification in existing program or major structural and curricular changes. Movement are only as effective in changing societal institutions and the attention they attract and the feasibility of the programs they purpose and stimulate. Some movements seek separation from the existing structure. In this chapter, we have referred theory of movement, the educational periods that have influenced today's education movement in the United States, with specific example and trends movement. By seeing and listening this video, you have studied about the nature of education movement, like the early educational movement, the alternative education and relative movement, and then we will summarize it, like in the nature of education movement, like the education movement come and go like the swing of a pendulum, reflecting the mood of the times, and they influence educational system, acting as pressure groups in the environment. Some movements stimulate the development of schools outside the traditional or public school system, others press for reform within the system. And then, in early educational movement, there are three influences from early European education on educational movement and system today are like the first, the influential method of teaching such as reasoning power, rhetoric, and the art of persuasion and rational inquiry. Second, human depravity of children, which encouraged authoritarian methods. And the third, Renaissance concept of well-rounded, liberally educated person that was several movements have dominated educational history in the United States: the public school movement, progressive education, essentialism, humanistic education, and the accountability movement. And the third, we have talking about the alternative education and related movement. The alternative education came at a time when all institutions in our country were being challenged. It focused on what adults felt was the oppressive nature of schools. Influential in movement philosophy were Summerhill and the English primary schools. From the movement came free schools outside the existing system and alternative schools and open classroom within. That was the 3 points of the educational movement and reform that we have discussed in these videos. Thank you for your attention and listening. Goodbye. Have a nice